Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 31st of October and we already uploaded a video today, but I found it's really important to do another one because we've received additional information, very specific pieces of data about the amount of Ukrainian forces that remain within the pockets, the amount of Russian forces attacking in Pokrovsk and entering into the city itself, the status of the city, including Ukrainian attempts to ameliorate the situation and get as many forces out as possible from the fire bag that is continuing to worsen and worsen and gets narrower in terms of its escape routes. So there's a lot to get into and a lot of updates, a lot of specific information about the command structure in the pockets, including the meetings that occurred yesterday between Syrsky and the leaders and commanders of the 7th and 9th Army Corps. They were the ones responsible for the Ukrainian defense in this region, and also meetings with the brigade commanders. So I want to talk about the dynamics in Pokrovsk and, of course, also with the Blackhawk helicopter landing that occurred a couple of hours ago, with at least 11 Ukrainian special forces operators from the military intelligence directorates dismounting and being targeted by the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade with FPV strikes. But we'll also discuss the decisions made by Syrsky to double down on the Dobropilia salient and some of the success that he's been able to achieve in recent weeks as a result, but then also some of the Russian gains that have occurred simultaneously. And if we have time, we'll also just expand our horizon for the first time in a week and look at what's going on in Dnipro and Konstantinivka. And then hopefully tomorrow we'll get to Kupiansk and various other regions that I've ignored. But let's get into this region. And it is always important to look at Pokrovsk because at this moment in time today, 40% of the recorded assaults by the Russians have occurred in this one sector, meaning from Pokrovsk to Mirnarod. 40%. That is absolutely insane. And it shows how a disproportionate amount of Russian energy and resources is now being concentrated in this region. I know there was the entire Ukrainian article about the 170,000 forces that are concentrated in this area, and that's a far more broad characterization of the situation, specifically around the pocket itself in a radius that is not immediate. We're looking at, I don't know, maybe 20-kilometer radius or maybe even more. In that radius, you have about 27,000 soldiers, and so many of them were actually stationed within an area like Selidove, or even further southwards, Mimrik, Ukrainsk, these sort of major nodes for organization, and maybe even some from Avdiivka getting fed into this, and Cheratina. And then closer to the line of contact, you have about 11,000 Russian soldiers. That's the number that was repeated consistently by the 7th Army Corps. Within the city of Pokrovsk itself, at this point, the Russians have infiltrated with a grouping of over 1,000 men. And at first, it was just DRGs, and they were extremely influential in determining the course of the battle because they were able to break through the line of contact, ensure that it was very porous, ambush Ukrainian forces, interdict their supply lines, cause a lot of chaos, and then pin down a lot of them before they can reorganize and fall back to better defended locations. And that included drone operators. A lot of drone operators were either killed or forced to abandon their equipment. And that reduced their defensive efficacy during critical hours when the DRGs were at the helm of many significant breakthroughs. And so since then, light assault groupings have also taken up this responsibility and are also heavily involved in the ground clashes in the house-to-house fighting. So at this point in time, it's not just DRGs, even though a lot of Ukrainian official sources are talking about it only being contained to DRGs. That is certainly not the case on the ground. You have light assault forces coming into the city on motorcycles, some cases of vehicles being used, but it is still premature. It has not been widely adopted just yet because, again, the Ukrainians do still have some drone operators that can target them and try to stop that sort of movement in its infancy. And that's largely coming from the Hornets of Dovbush units, which is a part of the 68th Jaeger Brigade. They've been heavily involved in repelling infantry in eastern Pokrovsk and some that try to enter in from Shevchenko and Pischane into southern Pokrovsk. Although as they get pushed back continuously and as their positions are undermined, they are forced to dedicate most of the resources to just stopping the Russian forces at their deepest extent. And so everything happening southwards on the rear becomes far easier and there's far less pressure on them. So that's been one of the most recent developments that has really eased a lot of the pressure on Russian logistics and has streamlined the process of movement of reinforcements to the line of contact. So the Russians can very easily replenish their forces. And more generally, as we look at the day-by-day situation over here, they're not suffering exceedingly high casualties because they are still in this sort of formation where it's semicircle. They're not trying to close it in their full force and their full entirety. That's the reason why the Russians are opting and have opted in many other cases to leave open a small corridor and have decided not to assault it all out and try to close it with whatever resources they have on the flanks. Instead, they try to sit back and try to gradually chip away at it and invest a lot in the drones and in the artillery and in the aerial assets needed to ensure that there is the maximum attrition rate yielded on the Ukrainian end as they try to withdraw from these locations. And as we can see, that's currently what's going on. The Russians are engaged in a high-intensity artillery campaign targeting Kryzhny because they understand that it's an area where the Ukrainians are rendezvousing at, whether it be Ukrainians that are leaving the city, and the first place they're able to actually enter and seek some sort of reprieve in would be Kryzhny, or if it's some of the battalion tactical groups that have been set up recently to organize near Kryzhny in order to act as a fallback force, as a blocking force, as a vanguard force, whatever it may be. But they are also being moved in from locations around Dobropilya. This is sort of the rear, and they're being moved southwards to Kryzhny in order to ensure that there can't be any sort of further Russian breakthrough. And I say this because on the 29th of October, we received information based on satellite imagery of the Russians with their DRGs successfully reaching ponds directly east of Kryzhny. So that is something that was extremely concerning to the Ukrainians, because the fact that there was a presence in these areas, presence of Russian forces, meant that both the defenders of Ukraine Street, which is already fully cut off, and then also the 00525 road, they would be just fully under Russian dominion. And so would the northern entrance to Pokrovsk, the northernmost location that you could go through in order to enter in, which is around these dachas. That would be exceedingly close to Russian forces on the ground. And so a lot of Ukrainians at this point, they're relying on this route that basically runs adjacent to the northern perimeter of the city. It runs adjacent to these dachas, and then from there, they take a right turn and move forward all the way to Rivne, and from there, Munirad. So that was really threatening at the time, 2 days ago. And the Ukrainians have adjusted their deployments of forces, whether they be the ones retreating or the ones coming in as reinforcements, in order to try to address the situation and prevent Kryzhny from being severed, from ensuring that the connectivity between Kryzhny and the pocket isn't fully severed, that there is still sort of a modicum of connectivity, even if it is very flimsy and it's very dangerous to move from one place to another. And that explains part of the rationale behind the Blackhawk endeavor that we saw embarked upon today by the Ukrainian side. And this operation is led by, the head of the GRU, Budanov. And so we have one UH-60 Blackhawk helicopter that dropped off 11 Ukrainians, at least. It maybe could be as high as 15, depending on whether more forces were able to dismount. That wasn't really caught on tape, but I counted the soldiers and I counted 11 of them getting off of the helicopter. And that occurred in this geolocated point that you see over here on October 31st. So they landed in this field, and again, they were able to do this likely because they were flying at a low altitude, which meant that they were able to just evade any sort of signal from the Russian side. And the video was filmed by a Ukrainian drone and was then leaked, according to Osman. This is a Ukrainian Telegram channel. They claimed that the clip was sent from one source to another until eventually it was leaked to the media, and that obviously would compromise the operational security, because now imagine extracting those forces. It would basically be impossible, because all Russian eyes will be on this location and trying to see if another Black Hawk will try to land over here. And after all, the Ukrainians only have 3 that we know of, and all of them are under the command of the GUR. And so they are really rare and a notable piece of equipment that is needed for the most important situations. And this is one of them when you think about it. If you're trying to think of like a situation where there needs to be extraction, or where you need to just immediately deploy some sort of high value force to a location in order to protect a high value location, like it would be in these sort of situations. So we already know the Blackhawks were used, and also Mi-8s were used during the Kozinka landing, and that was in 2024. So if you guys recall, at least one helicopter was destroyed by the Russians during that landing, and that occurred over here near Gryvoron and Kozinka, very famously. So there is already precedent for these sort of landing operations. They don't happen much, but within the context of extracting forces or acting as one component of a larger movement to act as a vanguard or act as a deblocking maneuvering force, then that could make sense, at least on paper. But then in reality, the situation is far different, because in reality, these 11 forces dismounted. Some of them took this turn to the gas station and were targeted over there. Others directly moved southeastwards and made it into the industrial zone of Pokrovsk. That industrial zone was taken over by the Russians during, the October 20th period all the way up until the 25th. You guys can see it over here. This is the industrial zone. Some of it is now marked as a gray zone due to these recent Ukrainian movements that try to change the situation, alter it in their favor. But you can see that the 30th Rifle Brigade, which is the main unit involved in the assaults over here in western Pokrovsk, they struck at least 9 or 10 Ukrainian soldiers. And that doesn't mean they were all killed, because there's not proof of that, but there's proof that they were struck. So they were either killed or wounded in all likelihood. And that means that the majority of the landing force is already really in a horrible state where they can't actually carry out the task, and they are either no longer alive or they need to be extracted themselves. So they were targeted in tree lines, some of them. So I would assume that's near locations like this or any other location that just is adjacent to the road that leads into Pokrovsk. And same thing would go for buildings in the industrial zone that were targeted, like the one in this geolocation. So they clearly were able to make it in. And I think the goal, when you sort of look at the bigger picture, would be to take back the entirety of the industrial zone. Taking back the industrial zone and also the areas directly to its east, like this, would be able to create a makeshift route and lifeline for the Ukrainians to leave the pockets. And this would be a continuous lifeline from Hryshny all the way to the gas station, and then from there to the industrial zone, then from there into the northern parts of Pokrovsk and the Donetsk microdistrict. But it would also require pushing the Russians back from their recent foray towards the northern outskirts of the city. And then from there, if that were to be the case, then there would actually be a steady stream that could allow for a very short, very small window of opportunity to allow more Ukrainians to leave Murad. That would be the sort of overarching logic, but that cannot be done with a single Blackhawk, and cannot be done by 11 soldiers. It would have to be a part of a larger campaign. And there are some rumors from Russian sources that there actually was a Ukrainian counterattack that started a couple of hours ago, and it's still in the process of unfolding. And they're claiming that they're going to release some footage of destroyed armored vehicles and targeted Ukrainian infantry tomorrow. So we'll see if that ends up being the case, and perhaps that could be part of the grand operation and grand scheme that included the Blackhawk landing as a certain part of it. Because you guys can see over here, there are a couple of major structures, like a concrete production plant. There's an electric motors facility as well. You have the Geological Research Directorate building located over here, which was heavily fought over between the Russian and Ukrainian sides just over a week and a half ago. And you also have some mine shafts over here. That's important. There are entrances to tunnel systems. So perhaps there are some forces over there that the Ukrainians would like to extract that are just hiding underground. Perhaps there are some resources, some ammo caches that they want to move out. Like, there are a lot of reasons why special forces could be operating in this region, but I do think that it is a part of a slightly larger plan. It's not a massive counterattack or anything like that. Don't get me wrong. I don't want people to have that perception, but I do think that they are trying to create the conditions for deblocking, so there could be additional forces that can leave in a safer manner. But the interesting thing about the mine shafts is that they weren't really talked about by either side much, but there are mine shafts in this region that then connect and are located under the entire rail line and connect to Kotline and then from there to Dachny. So those are potential escape routes for Ukrainian forces that are located in northern Pokrovsk. It's also a hiding point while the situation deteriorates on the ground, above ground, I should say. So that's a location that the Russians could be looking at taking over in the near future. But all in all, it is really interesting. And based on the footage and based on the targeting of Ukrainian forces, we can say that they have likely a presence of another 1.27 square kilometers of territory. But again, this is all relative, because this area that I'm marking in light blue is certainly very open, and we can't really say it's solidly under their control. It's just the most recent footage shows that there is a Ukrainian presence over here, albeit the group that we saw filmed, the majority of it was likely killed due to FPV strikes, meaning that their attempt to deblock the industrial zone definitely failed. They were not even able to make it into the center of the industrial zone. They were killed in the first buildings in the northern part of it. So for now, any sort of change to the front line would require more activity. So we do have other Ukrainian forces nearby that are certainly now in the stages of preparing for the aftermath of the battle and trying to help with the retreats. So, for instance, the 32nd Mechanized Brigade, they've been pulled out of Pokrovsk and are now in Hryshny, and at least one of their battalions is involved in the entire retreat process and helping evacuate forces. You have one battalion of the 152nd Jaeger Brigade in a similar situation right now. 155th Brigade is still located in northern Pokrovsk, trying to just hold on and ensure that there is breathing space for the withdrawing forces. You have elements of the 92nd Anti-Tank Battalion operating around here, and you have the 68th Jaeger Brigade holding on to the region between Pokrovsk and Murad, which is a complicated area right now. 25th Airborne Brigade, they are in one of the worst situations right now when you think about it, because they still have some of their forces from one of their battalions operating in Lysivka and Sukhyar. So they are going to be the hardest to extract. And there are a couple of dozen Ukrainian forces over here. The Russians are not even trying to overrun it because there's no reason to. There's no reason to even fight over it and attrit forces because the Ukrainians over here are completely unable to connect with the ones further north, let alone the ones in Hryshny. So they're almost completely encircled. Any attempt to leave would lead to very high casualties, but that's the only other choice besides, of course, staying there and fighting until the end or surrendering. So those forces are a bit of a distraction for the Russians, so they're not even trying to focus their resources on clearing them out. They're just pinning them down in that location. And this is occurring at a time where you still have a pretty large component of Ukrainian forces that have not been able to leave Murad. And the estimate that I've seen from a Ukrainian side is between 1,000 to 1,500 located in the pocket in its entirety, meaning every single location east of Hryshny. That's what I would sort of define as the pocket. So essentially, this area over here, I'm not going to highlight the entire pocket, or maybe I will, but you guys can see it over here, consisting of areas south of Rodinska, in northern Pokrovsk, in Lysivka Sukhyar, in most of Murad that remains under Ukrainian control, and then also most of Murad. So in total, the pocket amounts to around 90 square kilometers. So it is still a pretty significant chunk of territory, albeit many of the locations in blue are not really held on to by Ukrainian forces. They're just not controlled by the Russians. And if they try to enter in, then you have Ukrainian drone crews picking them off. So it would be more apt to show that a lot of these areas are gray zones, but then you would see that it's very porous and there are a lot of points that are just randomly and in very deep manners considered to be gray zone, so this map is a bit more uniform. But I do want to just look one more time at the Blackhawk landing, because the thing is, which unit was actually involved in that? That is important, because that would give us an idea of what additional actions the Ukrainians could be taking over the next couple of hours, because there was mention of some Bradleys being used, and if it's Bradleys, then it's probably 32nd Brigade, and then there's also the fact that this assault from the Blackhawk came from the GUR, directed by Budanov. So it could be from the Shaman special units. They are a really important component within the GUR, and they conduct a lot of paratrooping operations and operations in mountainous terrain. But they are currently deployed to Pokrovsk. Their situation is rather unspoken of. There's not a lot of publicly available information about the unit, naturally, because of its high value status, but it is operating in this region and was even before the Blackhawk incident. They also have the Stugna units, which is a part of the Timur unit, which is a larger force of about 1,000 or 1,500 men. And within that unit, there are a lot of smaller detachments that are distributed across the front line for various purposes. So Stugna is one of them, and they are also in this region, and they could be a potential option for a force that was involved in the helicopter landing or any other activities. And then you also have the 10th Special Purpose Detachment. They were operating in Kabul, by the way, in 2021. So, they have experience all across the world. And they are also involved in some of these really important clandestine operations in enemy territory or in locations that are extremely turbulent. So it could be any one of those units. So I'm just putting them all here for the sake of argument. And more generally, even yesterday, before this occurred, there was reporting from the Russian end that the Ukrainians were moving in reinforcements from the GUR, from the SBU, from really important drone units. So I would assume that includes the Birds of Magyar units. And also from the 93rd Mechanized Brigade. 93rd Mechanized Brigade is operating in the area between Rusin Yar and Konstantinivka. But it appears as if they may have sent in one of their battalions to act as a vanguard force, as a holding force in Hrishny. I don't know if it's true, which is why I've not adjusted the map, but definitely keep an eye out for that, because the Ukrainians really are scraping the bottom of the barrel for additional forces. And when it comes to trying to alleviate the situation, trying to push the Russians back slightly, that would require a large grouping of forces, and it would require a high quality amount. So that's why they're just organizing together whatever they can when it comes to the SBU, the GUR, an important brigade like the 93rd, which is operating in a part of the front line that isn't of the highest intensity, but is still pretty important. So that's just some of the information that's been coming out recently from this area. The other unit that is involved in activities in this region that is a part of the GUR is the Krila Special Unit. They're a part of the Department of Active Operations of the Main Intelligence Directorate, but they are operating, of course, in an area a bit further to the north than the other units. And by the way, this is a perfect segue to the meetings over the past 24 hours within the Ukrainian high command. So Syrsky, he's now located physically near the Pokrovsk axis. So he may have met in locations like to the west or to the north of Dobropilya with the Ukrainian commanders. And an area that I did see mentioned was Bokove, because there is a mine over here. And so this is a location where there may be some Ukrainian rear headquarters. And so there was a meeting between Syrsky and the leaders of the 7th and 9th Army Corps. As we said previously, 7th Army Corps is responsible for Murad primarily, so that's where you have 79th and 25th brigades, for instance. Those are the key units over there, along with the 38th Marine. And then the 7th, or rather the 9th, Army Corps is the one involved in Pokrovsk and in Hrishny. So the leader, or I should say commander, of the 9th Army Corps is actually Alexander Tarnovsky, and he was in charge of one of those directions of the front line that was just massive in its size. And I think it's called Hortitsia. It's the name of the entire sector. And it was at the time when the Ukrainians divided their sort of command responsibilities based on major sectors, then Tarnovsky had a lot of power at the time. And since then, they've reformed 2 Army Corps, and so the system is a bit different now. And Tarnovsky, he was the head of the 9th Army Corps. He, I think, was replaced or resigned in June because of health issues. But over the past couple of weeks, he was reappointed because the situation deteriorated to such a degree that his expertise and acumen was desperately needed. So he returned to the fray. And then the 7th Air Assault Corps, that's led by Yevhen Lasichuk. So he was also present at the meeting. And the thing is, the Syrsky approach now that we've been hearing about is that they are ordering the Ukrainians on the ground. And the thing is, the general staff and the commander-in-chief, Syrsky, they're the ones that actually give out the orders, including specific orders about brigade movements. And it's up to the commanders in charge of the Army Corps to execute it. They're not really the ones given the operational flexibility. They're more so the ones that have to oversee enforcement. So if you're looking for blame, then it has to go more so on the higher command for some of the decisions, if your disagreement is about the actual decisions and not the way in which they're carried out in reality. But what I'm trying to say is that Syrsky and people around him, they have been ordering the movement in of small groups of 2 to 3 men in order to move past Pokrovsk and into Murad to assist with the extraction operations and just to act as a vanguard force to hold out in the city for as long as possible. That's very difficult while the Russians are still running amok within the northern parts of the micro district over here, the Donetsk micro district. So that's one location where there is a conflict depending on the rank of the commander. Another thing that has been brewing for a while and now has really come to a head is the fact that Syrsky, he decided to redeploy in mid-August, and I think justifiably so, a large amount of air assault forces and other units from the Sumy region to help push back the Russians from Kucherev Yar and from areas to the west of Shachove, areas like Novoshachove, Vilny, etc. That was a good decision at the time and did help prevent a much more significant crisis than we're seeing today. But then he doubled down on that and sent in additional, not just regular mechanized infantry brigades, but also some of these elite assault regiments. And together, they were involved in operations to try to clear out the entirety of the Kucherev Yar pockets. And in September, that failed. They were unable to do so. But instead of adjusting and moving those forces elsewhere to locations where they may be more important, and I would say at the time it was more important to have them in Pokrovsk and Myrnod, but instead of doing that, he just doubled down and continued ordering attacks over here and ordering the Ukrainians to go on the offense, then in Nikhanorivka and then in Boykivka. That was eventually repelled. There was another attempt to attack into Rozhny. Then again, attempts to reinforce the Kazani-Turets River line. So much emphasis was put on this location. And when it comes to reinforcements, and you can see that with the deployment over here, the Ukrainians don't have a shortage of men in this location because you need to, first of all, have a pretty strong amount of forces, maybe not a surplus, but you need to have a sufficient amount of men to hold on to a very narrow part of the front line around the river line where you have a lot of key villages. And then you also need forces for a counterattack. And so that was accounted for based on Syrsky's deployment of forces. And that included a lot of elite units like 25th Assault Battalion, one of the battalions from the Skala Regiment. You have the 225th Assault Regiment. One of their forces was operating around here at a certain period of time. You have the Array Assault Battalion, and yeah, the list goes on. You can see I'm clicking on them. Black Swan Drone Group, 128th Reconnaissance Regiment, 132nd Reconnaissance Battalion. So a lot of these really important elements. Kryla Special Unit that we talked about before, Omega Special Purpose National Guard units, list goes on, etc., etc. So that was the emphasis placed at the time. And those forces, whether they be the actual larger units like the mechanized forces that could have been deployed to hold on to locations, or assault regiments that could have been used as rapid reaction forces to repel Russian attacks while they were in their infancy, if you're talking about, for instance, a DRG assault, because that's what Skala did in mid-August of this year. That was not possible because all the reinforcements were, one, exhausted last year during the situation in Kursk, that entire offensive, and the way in which it played out afterwards with the reinforcements having to hold on to Sumy and trying to absorb those attacks. And then whatever was left was sent to essentially hold on and push back in the Kucherov Yar region in Dobropilya. So very little was left for redeployment to the Pokrovsk and Myrnod salients. And I talked about this in the video earlier today, but I wanted to hone in on this point because it's very important. And so this is an area where there was a lot of disagreement between the 7th and 9th Corps and Syrsky himself. And they requested reinforcements even a couple of weeks ago, and Syrsky, his response as of now was to move in some of the rapid reaction forces, so the small assault regiments, to try to deblock the situation and hold out for longer. But that could only be enough to hold out for a short window of time to allow for reinforcements to leave, or not reinforcements, just for the people that are besieged to leave the pockets, but not anything more than that. You actually need infantry, large infantry units to hold on physically in order to ensure that there is a more viable, a more permanent change. And that's something that's completely out of question. It has been for a while now. The direction in which this pocket has been heading has been set in stone really since the August period, when Syrsky made the decision to focus most of his efforts on this region over here, which, I could see why, and we'll talk about this way more in other videos, because the situation in Kucherov Yar has very little to do with Pokrovsk on a geographic level, on a frontline level. It is important because, if you have a lot of intensity on one front, then you have less on the other, and there's a lot of fungibility between the fronts when it comes in terms of transfer of forces. So that's all true, but in terms of the way in which they're heading, the direction in which these assaults are heading, they're completely in different directions. Because the assaults on Kucherov Yar, not only were they threatening to Dobropilya, but that wasn't even the main problem. The problem is that it could the assaults over there had the possibility, and still do, of overrunning one of the final lines of defenses that the Ukrainians have completed building in the Donetsk region, and from there arriving at the highways leading to Droskivka, leading to the southwestern outskirts of Kramatorsk from an area that's exposed. So that's the real concern, and that's why there was a lot of emphasis placed on just killing that possibility in its infancy. And even now, with the recent gains by the Ukrainians that we'll get to, it's not been enough to completely get rid of the pocket, and so the salient can still be viable. And insofar as it is still viable, it's actually serving the purpose of closing out the Kazani-Turets River line, and that means that eventually, if that falls, the Russians will have to use that as a forward operating base, and that's something that they have really sorely lacked in this region. They've lacked large settlements, or even any sort of location where they can use it as an anchor or a basement to hide and evade Ukrainian forces, because now south of Kucherov Yar, all of their forces are hiding in tree lines and near quarries, which is extremely difficult and leads to very high attrition rates. So just to look through the Ukrainian counterattacks that have occurred over here simultaneously as the Russians continue advancing deeper in the pockets, they took back Dorozhny, so that's a capture of 1.7 square kilometers. They took back all of Vilny and Novoshachove, so that's another 13.7 square kilometers, including the dachas to the east of Vilny. So the 25th Assault Battalion captured it on October 25th. They were able to take 7 Russian POWs during that operation. And then north of Kucherv and also around the city or town, they have continued to expand their presence. So some Russian sources actually claim that the map looks more like this, that the dividing line is actually these 2 quarries and the nearby ponds, and that everything to the north is already within Ukrainian control. But I can't verify that. I do know that from the west, the Russians are actually launching assault operations towards Shehove. So they tried to reach Shehove from the direct route from the south, but that's largely been contained. There was also an attempt from the east a couple of weeks ago, and that was also stopped in its tracks. We actually saw 15 fab strikes on this location south of Shehove and east of Volodymyrivka, near a holdout place where the Ukrainians are just trying to drag out the fighting and ensure that there isn't any connectivity between the various vectors of assault that are closing in on the Kazany-Terets River line. So the new route of attack pursued by the Russians has been from the west, using this paved route that you see over here. So over here, you can see that the capture amounts to 4.94 square kilometers worth of territory. The 148th Artillery Brigade conducted on the 25th of October FPV strikes onto houses in Shehove, because these are locations where you had armored vehicles dismount forces, and then from there, troops were able to seep into the individual houses. So there were a couple of these mechanized assaults that the Russians pursued throughout late October, including on October 29th, there were 4 vehicles targeted within Volodymyrivka. On October 27th, you had a larger assault grouping, 29 vehicles. They attacked the entire pockets, and this was done not in one singular formation, but it was done in individual groups of between 4 to 5. So they took advantage of the poor weather and the difficult conditions for the drone operators. But according to the Ukrainians, and again, some of this is on video, some of it isn't, but they claim that the Russians have had lost 15 vehicles of various kinds, meaning 2 tanks, 12 armored fighting vehicles, and then just 1 private vehicle. So that's pretty much it when it comes to the situation over here. It is very difficult because the Ukrainians have a very strong drone apparatus over here. They're very prepared when it comes to their artillery systems involved. The drone operators are in a situation that is not really comparable to Pokrovsk, because they are far more solid when it comes to their positions. DRGs are not infiltrating into their positions in Sofivka or Turetska at the moment, even though they are very close to the line of contact. And you also just have a lot of forces on the ground that can be used to drag up the fighting in individual trenches or individual tree lines. Even if they are isolated, they can still hold out. And you can see that over here with some of the fortifications where they are still trying to fight and retain control over every single last inch of territory. And this actually reminds me of the fact that I was mentioning the situation with Syrsky in his meetings around Bukove. The same area actually, as reported by some Ukrainian sources, is now having HIMARS systems moved in, and Jeopard air defense systems also being moved in. So they're actually being sent closer to the line of contact now, likely in an attempt to just ensure that the Russian offensive capacity is slightly more limited. Here in Rusin Yar, the Russians have advanced to the north. They capture 1.43 square kilometers of territory. This is also in relation to an armored assault. This one involved 14 vehicles, including 1 tank. So the Ukrainians from the Phoenix drone unit claim that they were able to target all of them, but that does not mean that they actually destroyed them. And that's, again, from October 26th. It's an advance northwards of about, 1 kilometer. It is notable. There are a lot of excess trenches and ravines that still have to be cleared out before the Russians can actually go scorched earth and advance through completely open areas. And even though the Ukrainians lack many anchors in this region directly north of Yablunivka or Rusin Yar, they've still been able to essentially hold the line still, because the Russian priority has been focused much more on the west, on the Kazany-Terets line and on Pokrovsk itself, meaning that there's been time for the Ukrainian garrison, which is pretty large, directly south of Druzhkivka, to prepare for the eventual situation, which I believe will still be a big Russian priority going into 2026, to get control over this triangular open field area that to the east, with this eastern side, has the line from Konstantinivka to Druzhkivka. That's going to be a really important goal. And the vector of assault pursuit is going to be really based off of the Kazanets line and the paved road that runs along it, and then from there reaches southwestern Druzhkivka. And in tandem, you're going to see movements directly through the open fields. But in order to actually achieve that and achieve success, then you have to overrun and uproot the Ukrainians from their forward positions in these various anti-tank ditches and trench lines. So that's one of the other objectives that the Russians have to pursue over here before they can actually see some sort of success in that regard. And then just to finish off, I will look at Konstantinivka because I do think that this is another area that is pretty interesting. The Russian forces have been able to advance over here. This was on October 30th. It took over what amounts to 3.55 square kilometers worth of territory. And this is running along the rail line north of Ivanopilia. So the advance in a diagonal direction amounts to 3.2 kilometers. And this is a part of the process of finally clearing out the remnants, the vestiges of Ukrainian resistance in the trenches and tree lines that are south of Konstantinivka. So this region over here is in the process of being cleared out, and then Ivanopilia naturally will be next, along with Plishivka, with the main vectors coming from the northeast and from the south. You also have the infiltration into the Santorinivka microdistrict itself, which continues to increase in terms of the pace of the Russian assault. So you can see over here that 7.87 square kilometers of territory was captured, including this large pocket where there was some Ukrainian resistance and some forces holding out near the pond, near the tree lines, near the dachas. But based on recent geolocations, the presence of Ukrainians over here has become essentially impossible. And you could see that there is a geolocation from October 28th of small arms clashes in the northern part of the Santorinivka microdistrict, as the Russians were getting very close to this T0504 highway that runs across and bisects the entirety of the city, and then from there connects to the line of contact where the Russians are in control of Rusyn Yar. So this advance into Santorinivka amounts to about, 1.2 kilometers northwestwards within the microdistrict alone. And then to the south, in the southern part of the district, you have another 33 hectares of territory taken over. And let's click on this. You can see that this is from October 29th. The Curtin Company drone unit and the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 20th Mechanized Brigade conducted FPV strikes onto houses in Staraya Derevnia, which is this other district located south of Santorinivka, which you can see marked over here on the map. And it may also extend to this region. It's essentially just to the north of the Kryvyi Terets River, on the northern end of that riverbank. So you can see it over here, and it's an area that's largely been untouched so far, but it is now in the process of being assaulted by the Russians. They've been able to achieve this at a pretty fast pace because the Ukrainian infantry has not been able to actually sufficiently repel these assaults. You know, the drone crews that the Ukrainians have over here are very strong, but on the ground, it's been proven out that they actually lack the wherewithal to send in rapid reaction forces and to actually go in and clear out the troops themselves. So there are a lot of porous areas, not in the same fashion as Pokrovsk, but there are a lot of areas over here that are exposed, and there's a lot of coverage within individual houses, within the gardens, the plots of land, the bushes. All that can be taken advantage of, and the Russians are doing that right now, and that is exemplified with the northeastern and southern parts of Santorinivka, whereas the western parts and the central section of the district still remain in solid Ukrainian hands. But the next objective for the Russians will be full control over the district, because that will serve as a foothold needed to break through and take over the rest of the city. So that's all for today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video, and